Why was she alone on Christmas Eve? The wind doesn't ask permission. It drives the snow sideways across the mountain, hissing through the pines like something angry. Fresh boot prints cut a clean line toward the fence, 8 feet high, barbed wire at the top, the kind of boundary that says turn around. Whoever left those prints didn't slow down. They moved without caution, laughing low, convinced the land beyond belonged to no one who mattered. In places like this, they believed isolation meant weakness. Inside the cabin, Captain Evelyn Cross doesn't react like a frightened civilian. She doesn't rush for a phone or peer through the glass. She studies a monitor and exhales once, slow and measured, recognizing a problem she's faced before under very different skis. The disrespect is quiet but complete. Men, assuming the property is empty, assuming the woman inside is alone in the way civilians mean it, assuming no one is watching them cross a line that should not be crossed. A small wooden star hangs in the window, catching the last amber light of the day. It looks fragile against the dark timber and gathering storm. It is not. Captain Evelyn Cross is in her mid-30s, but the stillness in her face makes her seem older, like someone who has already spent her share of years listening for danger. She lives alone now, legally retired, a civilian on paper, a ghost in habit. Once she was a United States Navy SEAL sniper. In that world, she carried the call sign Echo 3, not as a nickname, but as a role that came with weight. The kind of weight that doesn't leave your shoulders just because you turn in a uniform. She bought the mountain in early autumn, 800 acres of hard silence. She paid for it in full. She asked the realtor for one thing more valuable than a view: keep it quiet. No announcements, no friendly welcome baskets, no curious strangers making their way up a road that barely deserved the name. The town noticed anyway. Small places always do. A woman arrives alone, buys land no one wants, keeps her head down, and people start building stories to fill the empty space. Some said she was a rich recluse, hiding money and secrets where nobody could find them. Others decided she was a survivalist, the kind that feared the world so much she needed to live above it. A few whispered that she was running from something, and the way they said it made it sound like she should be ashamed. Evelyn never corrected them. She wore plain clothes, faded layers, boots chosen for terrain instead of appearance. Nothing about her asked for attention. There were no medals, no unit hats, no stickers on her truck, and no stories in her mouth. Her calm made people uneasy because they couldn't place it. Most people in town smiled too fast, laughed too loud, or tried too hard to seem harmless. Evelyn's eyes did none of that. They didn't seek approval, and they didn't apologize for existing. When she walked into the feed store or the hardware aisle, she moved like someone used to being assessed. Not paranoid, just aware. She gave short nods, paid in cash when the card reader glitched, and left before anyone could trap her in conversation. Up on the mountain, she built a life that looked strange to anyone who had never lived under orders. The cabin was simple, but every choice inside it was deliberate. Tools lined up not for neatness but for speed, because a hand should never have to search in the dark. She reinforced the cabin alone, roof patched before weather could test it, insulation tightened, a wood stove installed like it was a mission requirement. She carried lumber in quiet trips, never rushing, never complaining, and never inviting anyone to feel sorry for her. She watched the wind the way other people watched sunsets, not for beauty but for information. She learned how it fell through the valley in the morning, how it lifted near the granite ridge, how it changed its mind at dusk without warning. The perimeter came next, a fence high and new with barbed wire that made the boundary clear even under heavy snow, trail cameras, motion sensors, angles of approach mapped in her head, clear lines she never explained to anyone. To the townspeople it looked excessive, like fear dressed up as construction. To Evelyn it was the minimum. It was not obsession. It was control after chaos. The kind that allowed a person to breathe without waiting for a knock that should not come. There were nights she sat in a chair facing the window, not in a dramatic way but in the simple posture of someone who didn't fully trust sleep. She would watch the dark settle, listen to the pines, and let the quiet remind her that nothing was happening. Sometimes in those moments she would glance at the small wooden star hanging in the window, hand-carved, imperfect, plain. She had put it there because she wanted something in her life that didn't come from training. The only local who didn't treat her like a roomer was Eleanor Briggs. Eleanor was older, strong in the way mountain women become strong, with hands marked by work and eyes that could read a person without needing permission. Eleanor ran errands that kept her moving between town and the edges of the national forest. She knew which trucks belonged, which ones were new, and which ones never stopped at the diner but still ended up on the back roads. She met Evelyn the way you meet someone you decide is worth knowing. No flattery, no nosy questions, no fake warmth, just a casserole left on the porch one evening with a note that said, "You will need this when the weather turns mean." Evelyn didn't invite her in that first time. She didn't know how, but she stood on the porch in the cold, holding the warm dish like it was something fragile. And for a moment, her face softened into something almost human. Eleanor never asked about the fence or the cameras. She asked if the stove drew well and if the roof would hold. She asked what kind of coffee Evelyn drank. And when Evelyn answered, Eleanor nodded like she had just gathered useful information for later. It was Eleanor's gift, that restraint. She sensed the weight on Evelyn's shoulders and didn't poke at it. She treated Evelyn like a person, not a mystery, and that alone made her different than everyone else in town. But there was something Evelyn hadn't told anyone, not Eleanor, not the town, not even herself on most days. The past still followed her, even when she didn't speak it out loud. It came in small flashes, a sound in the wind that reminded her of road or wash, a certain kind of darkness that looked too much like another winter far away. What happened 7 years ago that she can't forget? 7 years earlier, another cold season, she had laid in a hide with her spotter, Petty Officer First Class Luke Harland. He was young, sharp, and steady, the kind of operator who could read wind like a language and still make you laugh on the worst nights. Luke had been beside her when things went wrong, a mission built on bad intelligence, a mountain range that swallowed sound, a target that was not where they said he would be. Evelyn still remembered the moment the night changed shape, how the calm turned into something jagged. Luke didn't come home from that operation. There was no heroic speech, no clean closure, no satisfying reason that made it acceptable. There was only absence, and Evelyn carrying the memory of how quickly a life could disappear when someone else's decision failed you. Their troop commander, Commander Marcus Hale, survived the fallout. Careers have a way of doing that. He took the reprimand. He wore the consequences with practiced professionalism, and the machine kept moving. Evelyn didn't hate him. Hate was too easy and too loud. What she carried was something colder, a loss of trust that settled in her bones like winter. The Navy had offered her options afterward: desk jobs, training roles, a future that looked safe on paper. They had called it taking care of their own. Evelyn knew what it really was: a quiet way of moving her off the board because the system didn't know what to do with someone who had seen its failures up close. She left without ceremony. No bitterness, no dramatic exit, no farewell speeches. She simply turned in her gear, signed the papers, and walked away from the only family she had ever trusted. The transition was brutal in ways no one warned her about, not the physical part. That was easy, her body adapted. But the silence was unbearable. The civilian world moved too slow and too fast at the same time. People talked about problems that felt invented. They complained about weather, traffic, coffee orders. Meanwhile, Evelyn woke up at 0400 every morning, her body still on a clock that didn't recognize retirement. She tried to blend in. She worked at a construction company for 6 months, running equipment and staying quiet. But the foreman kept asking her where she learned to operate machinery like that, kept asking about her background, kept pushing for stories she wouldn't tell, so she left. She tried bartending for a while. Late nights, low expectations, tips that didn't require conversation. But drunk men got comfortable too fast. They leaned too close. They touched her arm when they talked. And one night, a regular grabbed her wrist to keep her from walking away. She didn't hurt him, But the way she removed his hand, the way her eyes went flat and cold, the way the entire bar went silent, told everyone present that she could have. She was fired the next morning, not because of what she did, but because the owner said her presence made people uncomfortable. She didn't argue. She understood. She made people uncomfortable because she refused to perform helplessness. The isolation wasn't new, but the aimlessness was. For years her life had structure, orders, purpose, a mission that mattered even when it hurt. Now she drifted through days that all looked the same, searching for something that felt like solid ground. She found it on a real estate listing late one night. 800 acres, remote, no neighbors, a cabin that needed work. The price was fair because no one else wanted it, too far, too harsh, too lonely. Evelyn saw it differently. She saw space, distance, a place where her skills weren't a liability but a language the land would understand. She made the call the next morning. Now on this mountain she had built something that felt like hers, not perfect, not peaceful, but hers. She had learned the rhythm of the seasons. She knew when the elk moved through the valley. She knew which trails the foxes used. She knew the difference between wind through the pines and wind against the cabin walls. And she knew, without question, when something didn't belong. The boot prints outside her fence weren't the first. There had been others, small signs at first, broken branches in patterns that didn't match animal movement, tire tracks on access roads that should have been empty, shell casings near the ridge where no hunting should happen. Evelyn had noted each one, photographed them, logged them in a file she kept meticulously organized. She wasn't paranoid, she was observant. There's a difference. Paranoia invents threats. Observation recognizes patterns, and the pattern here was clear. Someone was using her land, using the forest, treating the mountain like it belonged to them simply because no one had stopped them yet. Tonight they crossed the fence. That changed things. Evelyn stood and moved to the window, her movements efficient and quiet. She didn't rush. Rushing created mistakes. She pulled on a jacket, laced her boots, and checked the load in her sidearm, not because she planned to use it, but because preparation meant options, and options meant control. She stepped outside into the cold. The wind bit at her face, but she didn't flinch. She had felt worse. The boot prints were clear in the snow, cutting toward the tree line where the land dropped into a steep ravine. 4 men, maybe 5, moving with the kind of confidence that came from never being caught. But they had never been watched by someone like her. Evelyn followed at a distance, reading the tracks like a language. They weren't hunters. Hunters moved carefully, respecting the terrain and the animals. These men moved like they owned the place, like they were untouchable. One set of prints veered off toward a clearing she knew well. The others continued deeper into the forest. She made a choice. She would follow the group, document what they were doing, gather evidence. Let the law handle it the way it was supposed to. She wasn't a vigilante, she was a citizen, and citizens had tools that didn't require violence. But something in her chest tightened, a warning she had learned to trust. These men weren't just trespassing, they were hunting, and not for food. What were they really doing on her mountain? The trail led her down into the ravine where the pines grew thick and the snow lay heavy on the branches. Evelyn moved without sound, her steps deliberate, her breathing controlled. She had done this before. Different terrain, different stakes, but the discipline was the same. Ahead, voices drifted through the trees, low, casual, laughing about something that didn't deserve laughter. She crouched behind a fallen log and pulled out a small monocular. Through the lens, she saw them clearly. 5 men, late 20s to mid-40s, expensive gear, high-end rifles with thermal scopes, radios clipped to tactical vests that looked new, too new. This wasn't subsistence hunting. This wasn't even sport. This was something else. One of them knelt near a tree, examining tracks in the snow. Elk. He gestured to the others, and they fanned out with practiced efficiency. They weren't amateurs. They moved like people who had done this many times before, like people who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't expect consequences. Evelyn watched them for 20 minutes. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't make a sound. She had spent hours in hides waiting for targets that never showed. This was nothing. Finally, one of the men spoke loud enough for her to hear. "We've got time. Boss wants 6 before New Year's." 6, not 6 animals, 6 something else. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Video, timestamps, faces, voices, evidence. The men moved deeper into the forest and she followed, not close, just close enough. They reached a clearing where the trees opened up to a frozen stream. And there, staked into the ground, was a trap, not a legal trap, not a humane trap, a snare designed to catch and hold, to injure, to make an animal suffer until someone came to finish it. One of the men checked the trap, reset it, and moved on to the next. There were 4 traps total, all illegal, all cruel, and all placed with the kind of precision that said this wasn't their first time. Evelyn's hand stayed steady, but her pulse quickened, not from fear, from anger, the kind that burned cold and quiet. She had seen cruelty before. She had seen what people did when they thought no one was watching, but this felt personal. This was her mountain, her land, and these men were treating it like a dumping ground for their greed. She followed them for another hour, documenting everything. When they finally turned back toward the fence, she let them go. She didn't confront them, didn't reveal herself. Not yet. Confrontation without preparation was how people got hurt, and Evelyn didn't plan on getting hurt. She returned to the cabin as the first light of dawn broke over the ridge. She uploaded the footage to her computer, backed it up on 3 separate drives, and sent copies to an encrypted cloud account. Then she made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the evidence she had gathered. She could call the sheriff, report the trespassing, the traps, the poaching, but she had lived long enough to know how that conversation would go. A woman alone on a mountain accusing men with money and connections. They would smile, take notes, promise to look into it, and nothing would happen, because nothing ever did, unless you made it impossible to ignore. Evelyn wasn't naive. She understood how systems worked, how power protected itself, how the law moved slowly for some people and not at all for others, but she also understood leverage, and documentation, and patience. She would build a case so airtight that no one could dismiss it. She would gather evidence until the truth was undeniable, and then she would act. But first she needed to know who these men were, and who was giving them orders. She spent the next 3 days learning everything she could. She reviewed the footage frame by frame, identifying faces, clothing brands, vehicle makes. She cross-referenced them with hunting forums, social media, local business registries. Slowly, a picture emerged. The men worked for a contractor, a man named Derek Finch. He ran a guide service that catered to wealthy clients who wanted trophies without effort. Elk, bear, mountain lions, animals killed not for food but for photographs and bragging rights. It was legal barely when done with permits, but Finch didn't bother with permits. He didn't bother with seasons or limits or boundaries. He treated the national forest like his personal hunting ground, and he had been doing it for years. Evelyn found complaints buried in county records, reports from rangers, testimonies from locals who had seen his crews operating at night, but nothing stuck. Finch had money, he had lawyers, and he had friends in the right places, so the complaints disappeared, and the poaching continued. Until now, Evelyn leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't a ranger. She was a retired SEAL who wanted to be left alone, but leaving this alone meant letting them win. And she had spent too many years watching people like Finch operate without consequences. She made a decision. She would stop him, not with violence, not with shortcuts, but with discipline, with documentation, with the kind of patience that drove people like Finch insane because they couldn't understand it. She would turn her mountain into a trap he couldn't escape. And she would do it without firing a single shot. How do you fight men who think they're untouchable? Evelyn spent the next 2 weeks transforming her property into a net. She didn't add more cameras. She repositioned the ones she had, angling them toward approach routes Finch's men favored. She installed motion sensors along trails they used to access the ravine. She mapped their patterns, timed their arrivals and noted which nights they preferred. Always after dark, always when the weather turned bad, always when they thought no one was watching. But someone was always watching. Evelyn didn't sleep much during those weeks. She sat in the dark, monitoring feeds, logging data, building a timeline that would survive scrutiny in court. She didn't drink, didn't distract herself, didn't allow her focus to waver. This was a mission, and missions required discipline. On the night of December 23rd, the alerts triggered again. 5 men, same crew, same arrogance. They crossed the fence at 2100 hours, moving toward the clearing where they had placed the traps. Evelyn watched them on the monitor, her expression unreadable. This time, she wasn't just documenting, she was intervening. She pulled on her gear, dark clothing. No insignia, no identifiers, a headlamp with a red filter. Her sidearm secured but concealed. She wasn't going to war, she was going to deliver a message. She moved through the forest like a shadow, using terrain she had memorized over months of walking it in all conditions. She knew where the ground was soft, where branches would snap, where sound carried and where it died. The men reached the clearing and started checking their traps. One of them swore. "Empty again." Another laughed. "Patience, brother, we've got all night." Evelyn positioned herself on a ridge above them, invisible in the darkness. She pulled out a handheld spotlight, the kind used for search and rescue, and she waited. When the men moved toward the next trap, she turned on the light. A column of blinding white illuminated the clearing. The men froze, shielding their eyes, shouting in confusion. Evelyn didn't move, didn't speak, just held the light steady, turning them into statues against the snow. One of them reached for his rifle. Evelyn's voice cut through the night, calm and clear. "I wouldn't." The man stopped. They all did. They couldn't see her, couldn't locate her. The light came from above, from everywhere, from nowhere. "This is private property," Evelyn said. "You're trespassing, you're poaching, and you're on camera." Silence. Then one of the men laughed nervously. "Lady, you don't know who you're messing with." Evelyn's voice didn't change. "Derek Finch, contractor based out of Pineville, operates without permits, sells illegal hunts to clients who don't ask questions. You work for him. You've been here 6 times in the last month, and every second of it is documented." The laughter died. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Evelyn shifted the light, illuminating each man's face in turn. "John Graves, Michael Torres, Aaron Beck, Carl Ruiz, and you standing in the back trying to hide, that's Ethan Mills. Should I keep going? Or would you prefer I send this footage to the State Wildlife Commission?" No one spoke. The wind filled the silence, cold and indifferent. "You have 2 choices," Evelyn continued. "You leave now, you don't come back. You tell Finch this mountain is closed, or I press charges. Federal charges, poaching on protected land, trespassing with intent, conspiracy. You'll lose your licenses, your gear, and Finch will throw you under the bus to save himself. Your choice." One of the men stepped forward, anger overriding caution. "You think you can scare us? You're alone out here." Evelyn's laugh was quiet, almost sad. "I've been alone in worse places than this, and I'm still here. Are you willing to bet your freedom on that?" The man hesitated, his bravado cracked. Evelyn killed the light. The clearing plunged into darkness. When their eyes adjusted, she was gone. They stood there, breathing hard, looking at each other with uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Finally, one of them spoke. "Let's go." They left, fast, stumbling through the snow, tripping over roots, no longer laughing, no longer confident. Evelyn watched them from a different position, tracking their retreat until they crossed the fence and disappeared down the access road. She didn't follow, didn't chase, didn't gloat. She simply returned to the cabin, logged the encounter, and sent the footage to a secure backup. Then she sat by the window and waited. Because she knew this wasn't over. Men like Finch didn't take warnings. They took them as challenges, and challenges required responses. She was ready. What happens when respect arrives without asking? Christmas Eve arrived with a different kind of silence. No alerts, no movement. The mountain held its breath. Evelyn sat at the table, reviewing her files one more time. Everything was organized, time-stamped, cross-referenced. If Finch or his men made another move, she was ready, but the night passed without incident. The next morning, a knock came at the door. Not aggressive, not uncertain, just steady. Evelyn checked the monitor. 2 men, one in a sheriff's uniform, the other in a suit. She recognized the deputy, Cole something, young and eager. The other man was unfamiliar. She opened the door but didn't invite them in. The deputy spoke first. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Cole. This is Special Agent Daniel Mercer with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We need to talk." Evelyn studied them both. "About what?" Mercer held up a tablet. "About footage that was anonymously submitted to our office 3 days ago. Footage showing illegal trapping and poaching on federal land adjacent to your property." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Mercer almost smiled. "Right. Well, the footage is very detailed, professional quality, taken by someone who knows how to operate in low-light conditions, someone with military-grade optics." He paused. "Someone who understands evidence collection." Deputy Cole shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Look, we're not here to cause trouble. We just want to know if you've seen anything unusual. We've had reports of trespassing in this area." Evelyn met his eyes. "I've seen plenty. I've documented it, and I've handled it." Mercer nodded slowly. "That's what we thought. May we come in?" Evelyn considered it, then stepped aside. They entered the cabin and she watched them take in the space, the maps on the wall, the monitors, the organized files, the precision of someone who lived with purpose. Mercer walked to the table and looked at the screens showing different angles of the property. "Impressive setup," he said quietly. "You're not just watching, you're building a case." "I'm protecting my land," Evelyn replied. "Is that a crime?" "No," Mercer said, "it's not. In fact, it's exactly what we need." He pulled out a chair and sat without asking, a gesture that said this conversation was going to be longer than a courtesy call. "Derek Finch has been on our radar for 2 years. We know what he's doing. We know how he operates, but he's careful. He covers his tracks. And when we get close, witnesses disappear or change their stories." Deputy Cole remained standing, watching Evelyn with something close to respect forming in his eyes. Mercer continued. "The footage you provided, the footage that was anonymously submitted gives us leverage. Real leverage, but we need more. We need patterns, dates, locations. We need someone willing to testify if it comes to that." Evelyn's voice was steady. "I'm not looking to be a witness. I'm looking to be left alone." "I understand," Mercer said, "but here's the reality. Finch knows someone is watching him now. He knows someone disrupted his operation, and men like him don't walk away quietly. They escalate." Evelyn said nothing, but her jaw tightened slightly. Mercer saw it. "You were military," he said. "Not a question. A statement." Evelyn's eyes flicked to him, sharp and assessing. "What gave it away?" "Everything," Mercer replied. "The way you move, the way you set up this place, the way you don't flinch when 2 officials show up at your door. You're not scared, you're calculating." He leaned forward slightly. "Navy, if I had to guess. Special operations. Maybe EOD, maybe something quieter." Evelyn remained silent. Mercer smiled faintly. "You don't have to confirm it. I'm just saying I recognize discipline when I see it. And what you did out there, confronting those men alone in the dark, that wasn't reckless. That was controlled, tactical." Deputy Cole finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "Ma'am, we're not here to expose you or put you in danger. We're here because we think you're the only person in this county who has the skills and the will to help us stop Finch permanently." Evelyn looked between them. She saw sincerity in Mercer's face, saw the deputy's earlier skepticism replaced with something else. Respect, not the performative kind, the earned kind. "What do you need?" she asked. Mercer pulled out a folder and set it on the table. "Cooperation, your sensor data, your footage, your willingness to let us use your property as a monitoring point. We'll handle the rest. You won't be named in any reports unless you choose to be. And when this is over, Finch will be facing federal charges that actually stick." Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were documents, affidavits, maps of the region with marked locations where Finch's operation had been active. She recognized some of the sites, had walked past them without knowing what they were. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been watching him?" "2 years," Mercer said, "but we've never had someone like you in the equation, someone who understands terrain, someone who can't be intimidated." Evelyn closed the folder and looked out the window at the mountain. The snow was falling again, soft and steady. "I'll help," she said quietly, "but I won't be your bait, and I won't put myself in a position where I have to use force." "Understood," Mercer said. He extended his hand. Evelyn shook it once, firm and brief. Deputy Cole did the same, his grip surprisingly strong. As they stood to leave, Mercer paused. "For what it's worth, what you did, stopping them without violence, that took more restraint than most people have, especially someone with your training." Evelyn met his eyes. "Violence is easy, discipline is hard." Mercer nodded, understanding settling between them without further words. After they left, Evelyn stood alone in the cabin. The weight of the decision settled on her shoulders, familiar and heavy. She wasn't walking away from the fight, she was walking into it. But this time she wasn't alone. And this time the system wasn't failing. It was listening. Does peace arrive by accident, or do you build it? The collapse didn't come all at once. It never did. It came in small, patient steps that didn't make headlines but changed everything. Evelyn's documentation became the foundation: time-stamped images, sensor logs, movement patterns mapped across seasons. Daniel Mercer and his team built cases the way they were meant to be built: quietly, thoroughly, without shortcuts. Contractors were identified, equipment was seized. Trails that once carried men and guns into the forest went silent. The man behind it all, Derek Finch, never saw her mountain again. His network unraveled piece by piece, pulled apart by law instead of force, until there was nothing left to defend. Up high, the land noticed. Weeks passed without alerts, then months. Snow melted into runoff that fed the valley streams. Tracks in the mud belonged to elk instead of boots. Foxes returned to dens near the tree line. Birds nested where they had not dared before. The mountain breathed again. Trails reopened slowly, first to rangers and researchers, then to hikers who moved carefully, as if aware they were stepping into something earned. Word spread not as rumor but as reassurance. This place was safe now. Evelyn stayed where she was. She didn't lower the fence or dismantle the perimeter. Protection didn't vanish just because danger retreated, but she changed quietly. She answered Aliner's knocks instead of watching them through glass. They shared coffee at the table where maps had once covered every surface. Aliner brought food. Evelyn learned how to sit with another person without scanning exits. Community didn't cross the fence all at once. It gathered at the edges. Conversations, cooperation, trust built without pressure. Years passed. The mountain gained a name not in honor of her but in purpose. A preserve, a protected stretch of land where wildlife thrived and the quiet meant something again. Evelyn worked with rangers and conservation groups. Her role was never public, never advertised. She still checked the perimeter at night, still cleaned her rifle, not because she expected violence, but because discipline didn't leave just because the world grew calm. One winter evening, Alina stood beside her on the porch and said what others had been thinking for years. "You didn't just protect this place," she said. "You changed it." Evelyn looked out across the valley, watching the last light fade behind the ridge. "It changed me too," she replied. Peace had not arrived by accident. It had been built choice by choice, restraint by restraint, when force would have been easier. Peace was not something you wished for. It was something you protected with discipline. Another Christmas Eve arrives without warning, gentle instead of sharp. Snow falls straight down this time, soft and steady, laying a clean blanket over the valley. The mountain is quiet in a way that feels earned. A knock comes at the door just after dark. A child stands outside, lost on a trail, frightened but unharmed. Evelyn kneels, brings her inside, warms her hands, makes the call that brings a grateful parent racing up the road. When the child looks back and asks if she is the guardian of the mountain, Evelyn only smiles. After they leave, she stands alone by the window. The wooden star still hangs there, weathered now, edges smoothed by years of wind and cold but unbroken. She touches it once gently, understanding at last what it was never meant to be. It was never meant to be armor. It was never meant to be a reminder of what she lost. It was meant to be a promise. A small, fragile thing placed in a window to say, I am still here. I am still trying. I still believe in something worth protecting. Outside, the snow continues to fall. The wind moves through the pines like a whisper, and somewhere deep in the forest an elk lifts its head, listening, sensing nothing but the safety it has always deserved. Evelyn closes her eyes and breathes. The mountain is quiet, but she is not alone, and that finally is enough. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is choose restraint when the world expects rage. Peace is not given, it is built, one choice at a time, one boundary held, one moment of discipline when violence would have been easier. This is what it means to protect something, not with fear, not with force, but with the quiet, relentless belief that some things are worth more than winning. They are worth preserving. And that kind of strength doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true.